Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Jason Rosoff.
Today, we're going to talk about a nuanced and really seriously challenging topic. How to give someone feedback about their tone without becoming the tone police or being biased in some way, especially when the words themselves are technically fine, but the way that they're being delivered causes friction or annoyance or just unnecessary difficulty.
We received a really thoughtful question from a listener who's been using CORE, context, observation, result, and expected next steps, but is struggling with how to apply it to tone because it can feel more subjective. And let's just get into what the person writes. So they write, I love CORE and use it regularly, but I trip up when it comes time to use it for issues of tone. Specifically, I'm referring to times when a person's words are fine, but their tone is snippy and or off-putting.
Yes, I think like off-putting is actually a good word here, but let's come back to that.
Okay. I have one direct report in particular who has good intentions, prioritizes efficiency, and is extremely direct. These are good things in my industry. Her words are never inappropriate, but her tone tends to sound curt and it comes across as rude or self-righteous to her colleagues. When I give her or anyone else feedback about tone, I find it hard to get specific because we're in a more subjective area. Her response is usually that people need to stop being so sensitive, and if people don't like how she says things, she considers that their problem. This is a very
That's hard.
This is a very common thing, I think, with people who tend toward having a tone that can be interpreted as more sort of aggressive, is that they usually don't see a problem with it.
Yeah, or they assume that someone else's feelings are their problem, which in some senses is true. It is their problem, but
it's
also
not entirely inaccurate. Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think tone is a very important part of demonstrating you care personally. I've also seen this issue of tone weaponized against women, especially women of color, when they are direct and decidedly not submissive. Your tone was too sharp, snippy, aggressive, sometimes feels like another way of saying, I'm uncomfortable, so the problem must be you.
Yes, totally.
This struggle also applies to how to give feedback about passive aggression, which often involves nuances in tone. I have a few colleagues who are doing the drive-by passive-aggressive comments in meetings, and I know I'm not quick enough to shut down these comments as they happen. How can I more effectively respond publicly in a meeting when someone uses a tone that threatens to shut down the conversation?
Such a good question. And, every time I do a Radical Candor talk or a keynote, I think of this because I always suggest to people, especially when they're soliciting feedback, to ask a follow-up question or to repeat back what you think you heard. And immediately the tone of voice that is potentially a problem, and if you take my advice, is, you give me some feedback and I'll say, give me an example, Jason. Tell me, now I sound like I'm skeptical, but I mean, I'm doing what, the advice is. Or I'll say, oh, do you mean like when I, I say it back in some kind of sarcastic tone of voice. And now all of a sudden I'm sort of saying the right thing, but I'm saying it in a way that indicates the wrong thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting because tone is very observable, right? We're very good at picking up tone in the way people deliver things. I actually think that this is directly related to some of the research that came out during the pandemic about how having a phone conversation sometimes is actually more informative about a person's state of mind, because while it's really easy to misinterpret facial expressions and body language, and it's also somewhat easier for people to mask those subtle changes in tone, we're very sensitive to. So this is like human beings of like, our radar is up.
Yes.
For tone.
Yeah. And so like an example might be, Amy and I have talked about this on the podcast before, but I often misinterpret her facial expressions. What I've learned to say is, rather than you look skeptical, which is not really a criticism, what I'll say is, Amy, what does it mean when you're furrowing your brow? And she'll usually say, it means I'm thinking.
Yeah. I think this is sort of an interesting point of departure for this conversation is I wonder the way that the person wrote their note, and this is edited for television, so I may have said it slightly differently in the original version, but the way that they wrote their note, like, it's not entirely clear to me that this person knows when what they're saying is actually coming across this way.
Not the person about whom they're talking.
Correct. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. So I actually wonder if if one useful thing might be to ask the person, I observed a change in your tone there. Like, what does
Yeah.
that mean? Are you
Yes.
communicating something with that, or is it coincidental?
How do you feel about that word?
I feel like it's a bit of a value judgment. Somehow curt is less value judgmental than snippy to me if I was going to pick a word to describe. I think I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the person who wrote us this note because I think their intention is very clearly to help this person. And I think the way that they framed it is more about how other people react to the way this person talks. But I wonder if a way in is to focus on, I know this is how I feel about it, but I want to express, like, when you said this in this particular way, I felt like there was an implied criticism. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I think where we're moving towards is rather than saying you or your tone was,
Yeah,
I felt, or I think Jason felt.
yeah,
When you said this, I think Jason felt that, or I
yeah.
felt that. So we talk about this all the time, that like the I statement. What you're trying to do with an I statement is let one person know how you feel. It's like holding up a mirror, and you're helping them understand the situation through your perspective. You're not saying you're right, or through someone else's perspective. And you're not saying you are right or that other person's perspective is right. What you're saying is this is what's going on in the room. And let's figure out how to make something happen in the room.
Yeah, and I think that's why the non-judgmental language is really helpful because one, I'm aware as we're saying this that if the person who wrote us the note is correct, the person who they're trying to help, their reaction might be like, "You're annoying," and you're too sensitive.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
why are you
Yeah.
talking to me about your feelings? So, like, I'm aware that the impact statement might be really helpful. So we talked a little bit when you said, "This is how I reacted to that,"
Yeah.
and I think again, by focusing on your own reaction or something very concrete that happened in a meeting or something like that, I think talking about the impact was I felt like, when you responded that way, I felt like you really didn't want to hear what I had to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, instead of saying your tone was snippy,
Yeah,
saying, and this is not much longer, but
yeah,
in the meeting, when you said, we've already been over this, your volume went up and your
yeah,
voice sounded tight,
yeah,
describe what your observation was and then share the result. John flinched and stopped speaking after that. And then what's the next step? Let's talk about how to express your frustration, that we've already had this conversation, without necessarily shutting down input from others.
yeah. I certainly think that there's value in an approach that focuses on the goal. So, like, I think that getting this out is going to be really useful.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone who has previously suffered from, and I feel like I've mostly outgrown this, but I feel like there was a period of time in my life where I tended to be a bit more arrogant in the way that I communicated things. And I think the kind of conversations, the coaching that helped me the most was where I had a really good boss who basically was like, "What were you hoping to accomplish in that
Yeah.
meeting?" And the question is, like, do you think your approach to that conversation got you closer to your goal, or do you think it helped, or
Yeah.
do you think it might have hurt your objective there? And that's like appealing to enlightened self. And this is not about feelings or anything else, right? It's just about, like, what were you hoping to get out of that, and do you think that your approach is working? He was able to give me very similar types of examples of, like, when you said this, or like when you would often make the mistake of assuming other people understood something. And if they didn't understand it, I would be like, everybody should know this.
This
Like,
isn't that obvious.
yeah, it was very obnoxious. In retrospect, immature thing for me to do. But I feel like at that point in my life, an appeal to my emotions would not have worked. Like it
Yeah.
wouldn't have gotten through to me. I just
Yeah.
wouldn't have understood why that even matters. Because from my perspective, I didn't appreciate how I was expressing an emotion by responding in this frustrated, sort of arrogant way.
Yeah.
I thought I was being perfectly logical by
Yeah.
saying everybody should understand this. So like my perception of myself was, let's say, imperfect. And so it really, what focusing on the goals really helped unlock that conversation for me, because I realized I was often not getting the kinds of outcomes that I was looking for. And my arrogance had put me in this position of being like, well, I haven't tried anything. I'm all out of ideas.
Yeah. And it probably wasn't arrogance, because you're really not an arrogant person. It was probably like frustration. I notice sometimes with my son, he'll say things in a way that some would interpret as arrogant, but I come to understand in his case, his mind works faster than his mouth.
Yeah.
And he's so frustrated by that. He's really frustrated by himself, but it can come across sometimes as arrogance.
And that's why I think this, like, approaching it with curiosity.
Not that I'm trying to cast you in the role of my son.
I feel like that's a compliment. The idea here that I think is so valuable is like, you want to, one of the reasons why you might be struggling with core is just the frame that you're taking. So like core is really good for content structure, but it doesn't tell you what point of view you should be using in order to present the feedback to somebody. And so maybe like one piece of advice is think about changing the frame. So instead of focusing on the emotion that happened, or even the conversation being shut down, because maybe it was their goal to shut down the conversation because they're actually feeling quite frustrated with how it was going. Instead, focus on their goals and objectives, their results, and say, like, because as their boss, you probably do have examples of times where it's like, well, then we had to redo that conversation again because we didn't actually hear from John during the discussion. We didn't have his input, and as a result, we made a decision that was not effective. That, and ultimately, like, that's on you. Like, your job is to get the best outcome possible. We didn't get the best outcome in that situation.
Yeah. And I think the exact inverse can be like, there was a time in my career where I tended to sound insecure, probably reacting to having been given feedback that I sounded arrogant. But I would stop and I would say, maybe I'm wrong, and, all this stuff. And rather than telling me that my tone was insecure, which would not have helped the situation, my boss said to me in the meeting, so that's the context, observation, when you kept saying maybe you were wrong, the result was that people came away really unsure whether you cared about this, And then the expected next step, what he said in the end was, he said to me, Kim, you are really good at your job, but you are not so good at your job that you can afford to run yourself down this way. Stop doing that. And it was like really helpful for me to hear that. But if he had said your tone is insecure, try to be more confident, unhelpful.
So we've been talking a little bit about like maybe some strategies or things that might be helpful, things to try. But I think it's important to take a moment and just point out that there are some things people should definitely not do in a situation like this. And I say this because we don't necessarily appreciate how language can be coded. So like the words that we choose to describe something can be coded, because to your point, like projecting confidence is often a piece of criticism. So like seeming insecure or not projecting confidence is a piece of criticism that women often receive, because the way that our, like, socially we code confidence is male.
And also, if you act too confident as a woman, you get criticized for that.
It's the double bind.
Yes, all kinds of problems.
It just, because of this, as the writer noted, because this topic can easily veer into bias, we actually want to check both our language and our intent, right? It's not just what we say, but why we chose that language. So we want to avoid coded language like saying the person sounds aggressive or shrill or abrasive, or using the word asshole to describe them. This is both bad because of the sort of coding of the language, but also because it's similar to not sounding confident. It's just very unclear. Like, what are you supposed to do with that kind of feedback?
Yeah. So rather than saying, watch your tone of voice, you sounded like an asshole, you want to be more specific rather than
Yeah.
using that kind of coded language. And this is top of mind for me because I've gotten feedback recently. I have gotten feedback that it sounds like I'm criticizing the men, but not the women in the room. One of the things I try to do is ask myself, if I'm going to use a word to describe a tone, I'll ask myself, would I use that same word if I was talking to someone of a different gender, a different race, a different age, whatever. And another thing that I've been doing recently, if I have time to prepare for the conversation, is to use AI. AI will tell you what on average the world, it may not be right, it may be hallucinating, but it's worth checking in and getting its perspective. And there's some tools that are specifically designed for this, like Textio. But sometimes I'll go to Gemini and then Claude and then ChatGPT and say, is this word coded in some way? And it'll have an opinion.
There's so much like cultural subtlety to like, whether it's age or physical location or sort of family of origin background. Like, I feel like all these words that we use as sort of shorthand that we think when I say asshole and you say asshole, like we mean the same thing. We often are proud. It's imprecise. Like the language is imprecise. We're like trying to describe something. So like the advice you gave is exactly right, which is like be more specific. And I think beyond being specific about what you're observing, so tone, as you said before, Cam, it could be volume, it could be sort of like the tightness of somebody's voice. Like we can get more specific as to what we're describing, and combining that with impact. So saying, this is what I observed, this is the impact that thing had, and can we talk about, maybe if you do that in a non-judgmental way, you're not necessarily saying, oh, you used the wrong tone. You're saying when you spoke in that particular way, this was the result that it had.
Yeah, it had this impact on this person.
Right, exactly.
The impact that it had on that person is going to affect the work that you're trying to do. The problem might be just that you hurt them, and that's problem enough. But if you don't care about that, there's these other more practical impacts on your ability to deliver on this project or whatever.
Yep.
I want to reassure the person who wrote us this note. We know that you never would say you sounded like an asshole.
I think this person clearly went out of their way to try to be as specific as they possibly could in the way that they described the situation. So they're on the right track. And I think the hard part, especially about going back to that word off-putting, when you have someone on the team who communicates in a way that seems to set other people on edge, like they tend to sort of tense up. It's really easy, I think, to sort of fall victim to the fundamental attribution error and assume that the person means, that they mean it, that they intend for that result to happen. And it's very clear that the person who wrote us this note is not in that position. But I just wanted to acknowledge and commiserate momentarily, having been this person and worked with people who sort of fall into this pattern of behavior. It's useful to take a step back and remember that, there's a high probability that's not this person's intent.
Yeah, extend a little grace to them, which it seems like the person who wrote us a note is extending grace. But even if you extend grace, if they're having this impact on others and they can change it. I mean, another sort of nuance is that sometimes you might need to talk to the others. Like the feedback I got that I was not likable and I was not doing anything that was necessarily unlikable. It was other than showing up as a woman and being competent,
Yeah. Yes. Here's my guess, sort of reading between the lines a little bit. My guess is that this person has done a reasonably good job of assessing, like it's not just the other people.
Yeah, it's this person. Yes.
Like this person's behavior is having this impact. But I think that's why I wanted to talk about the things we shouldn't do, because I think not assume, like extending some grace, not assuming that it's the person's problem, like that it is in fact this person's communication style, like checking our own, our own biases and discomfort, and being willing to at least explore the possibility that other people are not doing the reverse, extending the person that
Yes.
the grace that they're due.
Yeah. I think another thing that can help here is to look for times when the person is getting it right.
Yes.
Praise.
Yeah.
Praise. As very often this person, I mean, let's assume that very often this person who sometimes seems incredibly curt and is offending people with their brevity, but sometimes they get it just right. And so pointing out to this person when they get it, the context, observation, result, explore next step, when they get it right, it may be even more helpful than when they get it wrong. So in this morning's meeting, that's the context. When you said that you were very interested to learn more about why the person thought that, the result was that you could see the person's shoulders relax and you had a brief conversation, like 30 seconds, but you got to a shared understanding much more quickly. So that was the result. Do more of that.
I think that's exactly where my head was going next.
Great minds, Jason.
Yeah. I think because when I think back on my own experience with this and getting coached on it, one of the things that I remember most clearly was walking out of a meeting and my boss turning to me going, "That went much better, didn't it?"
Yes.
I remember it both because it was sort of like, I feel a feeling of pride of like trying something new and having it succeed, but also because I felt intuitively that it had gone better. But if he had not pointed it out, if he had not verbalized that it had gone better, I think there would have been a doubt. There would have been a question in my mind, like, was it just me or did it actually go better? And so, like, the praise piece is I think is going to be your best friend to get out of the hole.
Yes, absolutely. So what about private versus public? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think the end of our listener's note made mention of this idea that there's a thing that's happening in meetings, which is not just the person that they initially wrote in about, but other people on the team seem to have a habit of making passive aggressive comments in a discussion. And the person writing in said, I feel like I'm not acting quickly enough to address those comments. And as a result, it's creating an environment. We've all been in a meeting like that.
Somebody says something that offends someone else. The other person rolls their eyes. Everybody notices both things. And you're leading the meeting and it's unclear how to deal with it.
Yes. And or other things like you have a discussion that is, fruitful or impactful, but maybe someone makes a comment of like, oh, that we could have gotten that done much quicker. And it's clearly not intended to like actually help. There's no helpfulness to it, but it is like clearly intended to. And so now you've got a situation where the people who are productively participating feel criticized, even though it was indirect.
Sarcasm can be deadly to relationships and to productivity in a meeting.
Yeah.
And it can be funny also. That's why it's so hard.
I feel like maybe part of the reason why we work well together is that I think we can both appreciate the sarcastic wit. But like, I think it's a really important, really good question, which is, can you address it in the moment or do you address it after the fact? Because it's a little bit tough, I think, to your point, that someone insults somebody else or says something sort of critical or passive aggressive and the other person acknowledges it, but in a passive aggressive way.
Yeah.
It creates a vibe, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like it creates a feeling in the meeting of we're pretending that everything is okay.
Yeah, it's false harmony.
I think I feel like when I have been in a situation like that where it got bad enough where I wanted to address it, I think one time, this is back at Khan Academy, I remember like we were in a meeting with Sal and the team was very frustrated with him because he was doing a little bit of seagull management. He was swooping and pooping on something that we were working on. And the team was very quietly frustrated. Sal was very quietly frustrated. And I remember saying something like, this feels really awkward.
Yeah.
It feels like there's something unsaid, something that's going unsaid here. I remember saying, like, turning to the person on my team and saying, I know you well enough to know that you're frustrated by this. Like, what's on your mind?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because I turned to Sal afterwards and I said the same thing. Like, I know you're not happy either. Like, what are we missing? Like,
Yeah.
what aren't we saying here? And I remember the feeling of like the room had become pressurized.
Yeah. You provided a release
I
valve.
opened the window and fresh air came in. So the reason I give that example is because this was clearly not one person. This is clearly like the whole meeting had taken on an unhelpful, unproductive tone. And I was just sort of like, and I actually got a laugh when I was like, this is super awkward.
Yeah.
Like, this meeting is super awkward. Kind of got a chuckle. And I think that gave people a little, just like a second of coming back to themselves, like being like, oh, this is real. We're feeling this thing. We're not ignoring that we're
not ignoring the sarcasm. The thing about passive aggressive behaviors, it's very hard to address it. Or the thing about tension is that nobody wants there to be tension. And so we tend to ignore it. And then it gets worse. It gets more tense, not less.
Going back to the beginning of like, this is all subjective, but it was like, I knew the people in the situation well enough. Like, Sal was doing a thing that he had a habit of doing, which was like asking kind of pointed questions about things. And like, there's like a thing he couldn't let go.
Dog with a bone.
Yes. And it was very polite. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like on the surface, it was very polite. And I could tell that the team was like, asked and answered, with no badgering the witness.
Yeah.
Like that's what it felt like. Yeah. The team felt like they were being treated like hostile witnesses and being asked the same question 10 different ways.
Yeah.
It was not the words. It was just like, it was the way that it was being delivered.
Yeah. It's just giving voice to what your interpretation of the tone. To me, this is awkward.
Yeah.
Is really good.
So I think so I was going to say, if it's a group thing, I think you might try an approach like that. I think if it's one person who's making an offhanded, sarcastic comment, like on the way out of a meeting or something, I would probably approach that person individually and say, I'm not exactly sure what you intended when you said that at the end of the meeting, but to me, it came across as sort of sarcastic or passive aggressive. And I think my goal is to understand what's underneath that. Like, help me understand what you meant. Like, why did you say it that way? Like, what is actually going on? Like, what are you feeling?
Yeah, maybe it wasn't passive aggressive. Maybe there was something else going on, but doing that in a spirit of inquiry. As you were telling the story, there was one time when I was at Google that I saw this done very well publicly, but in a very supportive way. This was a big meeting. It was a TGIF meeting. So there were, I don't know, a couple thousand people in the room. And Sergey, one of Google's co-founders, said something and he offended 30% of the people in the room. He didn't mean to, but I remember the tension. I remember the feeling. And Eric, who was CEO at the time, stood right next to Sergey, put his arm around his shoulder and said, I think what Sergey meant to say was, and then he said it very differently. And everybody burst out laughing. Nobody was offended. And Sergey said, thank you. And so sometimes it feels like ignoring it is doing someone a favor, but the real favor to them is to say it again for them what you think they really meant.
So I think that there's a couple of strategies here. One is sort of like address the room. Another one is like help the person out. So like if it's an individual who's making a mistake, you can try, I wonder if what you meant to say was that. I think something like that. But I do think that sometimes it's not feasible or you're unsure enough about what's going on that it doesn't feel appropriate to address in the moment. But I do think that it's important, especially if it's a repeated behavior, to address it privately at a minimum, just to say like, I've noticed this happening in meetings and I want to understand where it's coming from, because it's definitely leaving me feeling like there's something going on here that I don't understand.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Those are words to end on. Like, there is something going on here that I don't fully understand. That's really what this is all about. What tone is all about is like, I don't, it made me feel a certain way, but I don't understand what you were really trying to say.
Yeah.
So are we ready for the checklist, or do you have other? Okay. No. Tip number 1, describe don't judge. Replace labels for tones with, as clear as possible, a description of what exactly happened. So you can describe the vocal cue, the body language, and then the impact that those things had on others. And be open to the fact that maybe the impact wasn't fair. Like you want it to extend a little grace.
Yes.
Maybe.
Because tip number 2 is check for bias, which is we need to be aware of how identity, culture, communication styles, cultural norms on a team can shape our perception of tone. And to ask ourselves, if we change the situation slightly, like if the person was a different gender or a different team, a meeting where I wasn't leading it, for example, like if I was
Yeah.
in the audience and this person said it, would I feel the same way about it?
Yes. And then tip number 3 is redirect, then follow up. So if what happens is in a public meeting, don't think of this as public criticism of the person. You're throwing the person a lifeline. I think what
Mm-hmm.
they really meant, if that feels like the right thing to do, it's not always the right thing to do. And then afterwards, after the meeting, privately, you can use core to unpack what happened and how it landed and how to get things back on track. Those are our tips. Before we end, I'd love to talk about something that happened over the past week. Do you have another couple of minutes, Jason?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this is not about this episode, but I feel like there are things happening in the world that must be talked about. And this is one of those things. So one of the things that I love about having written Radical Candor and doing this podcast with you and Amy, Jason, is that I get to talk to all different kinds of entrepreneurs and managers. And, I'm in Silicon Valley. So a lot of the entrepreneurs I talk to happen to be in tech, but not all of them. In fact, one of the people who I have most enjoyed speaking with over the last really 17 years is a guy who helps restore like church courtyards and parks to plants that work well with our environment. So plants that are, don't take up too much water, aren't going to create fire hazards, but also will protect from mudslides.
Mm-hmm.
all of the things. And I really admire this guy. I was walking by him and his team as they were doing some work in the neighborhood, and they were laughing. And I said, why don't we work like that more often? They're
Mm-hmm.
just wonderful human beings. And about 9 days ago at 7:30 in the morning, ICE showed up at his house and took him away, and wouldn't tell him where they were taking him, wouldn't tell his family where they were taking him, wouldn't allow him to call his family. And so for 7 days, his family had no idea where he was. He has a life-threatening illness and didn't have his medicine. And we were all in a panic about whether he was going to survive this ordeal. He had working papers, but he was taken back to the country where he was born. He was deported. And he could fight it. He could probably, but why bother? Like, he's built a successful business. Like, why is he going to come back here and pay taxes here when he can build a great business there and pay taxes there? And I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to come back either if I were him, but I'm so ashamed of the way he was treated by this country. And I just want to hold some space for him and his family. I was there. I went to visit his family over the weekend. He has a beautiful 5-year-old granddaughter and 7-year-old grandson. He called while I was there, and he's so close to his grandchildren. And I could see the tears in his eyes. He doesn't know when he's going to get to see them again.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be discussed a little bit.
Yeah, I think what you just did is maybe the most important thing, which is to bear witness, to recount the story. I feel something that I've noticed is that there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the world. And when the bad stuff is happening to you, it's very easy to feel ashamed and alone because there's a part of us that always questions, like, what did I do to deserve this? Like, why is this thing happening to me? And when someone else just bears witness to your story and is able to put words to it and say, this is the thing that happened to this person that I know, and they're of value. This person is of value. They mean something to me. They mean something to their community. When we do that, I feel like it helps to make real the abstract badness. And maybe most importantly, it can really, it even if indirectly, help this person and their family feel like that their suffering has not gone unnoticed. Because the way that this person was treated was incredibly dehumanizing.
Yeah,
And
deliberately cruel.
yes. And the ultimate humiliation is that it's all done in secret.
Yes.
I feel like that's like the knife through the heart of the person who's already suffering, is to have their suffering be secret.
Yes.
Especially when it's so clearly like it's clearly
so
unfair.
obviously unjust.
Yes,
What
exactly.
happened was so obviously bad. And it's, unfortunately, it's going to get a lot worse. The tax bill, you know, spending a lot of money to do a lot more of this. And I think it's really important that we don't just ignore it.
Yeah, that we don't become sort of try to inure ourselves to like the actual depravity of it's like the phrase the banality of evil comes to
Yes.
mind, because it's like the individual things you sort of feel like, the like the intent to deport criminals and all this other stuff.
This man is not
Yeah,
that's the problem with that language, is that that's part of where the shame comes from. And this is a good family man who built a good business. He's an entrepreneur. He works really hard. He's totally honest.
yep.
Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, and I think the reason why I was saying that is like the ideals mask the true banality of the actual evil that is being done. Because like, you know, first thing in the morning, dragging them out of this person out of their house, not telling their
Yeah.
family where they're going. The actual implementation, it
Yes.
matters. It really matters. But it's very easy. I think it is too easy when we don't tell these stories, when we don't share our own personal experiences of running into the actual implementation part of policies like this. We allow for the mythology of the sort of like the intent to be louder than the actual reality of what is happening.
Yeah, yeah. And the banality, I had that same thought. The reason why I responded, so one of the ICE has a website, and you can go and locate supposedly somebody that's been, but of course it returned, there's nobody. So call this number. You call that number and it hangs up on you. It's like it is enraging. And then you go to the center and the door's locked and they won't talk to you. Like it's so enraging. I couldn't even, I think I just told you about this today. Now that I know he's arrived and he's okay. Like, I was
Yep.
really afraid he was going to die in detention. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an immigration lawyer, and he said that the other thing that's sick about this is that now you feel glad. He's now not in this country anymore, but you get a phone call from him and you feel like it's so sick.
Yeah. And I think paying attention to that is just so important, because when we don't focus on those details, it's just very easy. It would be very easy to imagine that the story is a one-off and this isn't like, like this is just a couple of But one of the things that I noticed in your telling of the story is I've heard a dozen other stories just like this.
This is happening every hour, every day.
Yes. Like almost exactly the same. Like, dragged out of bed, no one knows what's going on, they can't find any information, none of the phone lines work, the website doesn't work, like the same exact thing. This story is happening over and over again. And so at some point we have to come to grips with the fact that this is by design.
This is the banality of evil. They're trying to make it feel this way.
I think that part of me that is a patriot disgusted
Yes.
Like the
Yes. And the part of me that is a patriot, I want to try, and I want to also end on at least an attempted note of we can do better and people are doing better. There was a great story in the Times about an immigrant named Carol who was detained by ICE in Missouri. And when her colleagues at work learned what had happened to her, they printed T-shirts, Bring Carol Home. They raised $20,000 to cover her legal expenses. So people can do the right thing. People can absolutely do the right thing. And I think a lot of the people who this man worked for will help him get on his feet. But I sure wish he were still here laughing in the neighborhood so that I could, I miss him. That's all. I wish he were here.
Yeah. Well, on that note, our encouragement to everybody is to find a way,
to help
whether
someone who needs it.
Yeah, to help to do the right thing. I think that the audience of this podcast, like one of the reasons why people listen is because we talk a lot about, like, in whatever small way, trying to do the right thing, to do right by people. So go out and do the thing that you want to do anyway, which is to do the right thing.
Thanks so much. And I hope everybody has a great day.
If you would like to see show notes for this episode, head over to radicalcandor.com/podcast. We will really appreciate your feedback, praise in public and criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us wherever you're listening to your podcast, and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. And if you do have feedback for us or a question for a future episode, you can always email us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. We read every one.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.